In today's video, we are going to talk about the United States of America and the 45 American men who held the title of President of the USA. So if you want to know the evolution of US political parties and which presidents came from each party, how did we come to swear the president in on January 20th, some surprising stuff about the Electoral College, and how to become president without a single Electoral College vote, various presidential firsts, how many US presidents owned slaves, and how many slaves did they own, why being tall comes in quite useful if you want to be the president. Keep watching. This is part 1 of a 2-part video, and if you're watching this in the future, you should be able to find part 2 linked in the description below, as well as at the end of the video. The USA declared its independence from Great Britain on July 4, 1776, as most of you will know, but achieving full independence took a few more years, the Revolutionary War ending in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which formally recognized the US as an independent nation. 4 years later, in 1787, the US Constitution was adopted, and the following year presidential elections were organized. The election began in December 1788, when electors were chosen, and voting continued all the way into January 1789. This was the first presidential election under the new US Constitution, and organizing it took time. For example, different states followed different timelines for appointing electors, which dragged the whole thing on. George Washington was unanimously elected by the Electoral College, but it took until April 30, 1789, for him to be inaugurated in New York City, which had been chosen as temporary capital. After a short stint in New York, Philadelphia then took over as temporary capital for the next 10 years between 1790 and 1800. This arrangement was part of a compromise in the Residence Act of 1790, which established that a new, permanent capital city is going to be built along the Potomac River, what then became Washington, D.C. At the time of Washington's inauguration, there were almost no countries in the world whose leader was called president, with most states headed by kings, queens, emperors, sultans, and so on. So while today having a presidential republic and a president is basically no big deal, the form of political organization that the US chose in the late 18th century was definitely a very innovative thing for the time. George Washington and John Adams were the only two people that became presidents before the White House was built, with Adams moving there on November 1, 1800, just a few months before the end of his term. The White House was still unfinished, with ongoing construction and some rooms incomplete, and Adams' wife, Abigail, apparently using the unfinished East Room to hang laundry due to the lack of space. Let's imagine for a brief second Melania Trump having to do that. Jumping to the future, I should also say that the White House was named the President's House or Executive Mansion, with Teddy Roosevelt officially naming it the White House in 1901. He ordered the words "The White House, Washington" to be engraved on official presidential stationery, making the name official. Back to the 1800s, when Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801, he became the first president to spend a full term living in the White House, and every president since then has lived in it. Except when the British burned it down on August 24, 1814, and President James Madison had to evacuate. Rebuilding it took 3 years, with James Monroe, the next president, then moving back in during 1817. Since we have so far mentioned the first 5 presidents, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, we should also say that these are the presidents considered to be among the founding fathers of the USA. Monroe was younger and less involved in the drafting of the foundational documents, but he did fight in the Revolutionary War and played a significant role in early US diplomacy and policy, so we can see him as a transitional figure from the age of the founding fathers towards the next generation of US presidents. He's also the creator of the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said to the Brits, the French, and other Europeans, "Keep your greedy paws out of the Western Hemisphere." I guess this is also what China is now trying to say to the US about their neighborhood, so let's see how that is going to turn out in the coming years. Now let's talk about the slave situation. Out of the founding fathers, John Adams was the only one who didn't own slaves, both him and his wife Abigail being vocal about their disapproval of the institution. John Quincy Adams, his son and the 6th president, also strongly opposed slavery and became an outspoken abolitionist after his presidency. Overall, out of the first 18 presidents, 12 had owned slaves over their lifetimes and 8 owned slaves during their presidencies, with George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, and Zachary Taylor each owning upwards of 100 slaves. The US presidential elections have been held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November since 1845, when Congress passed the Presidential Election Day Act. The November timing was chosen because it aligned with the end of the harvest season, allowing rural voters to participate, and avoided having people travel to vote later in the year when winter set in. Until 1933, the US did not inaugurate its president until March, leaving the old administration in charge for another 4 months after Election Day. The ratification of the 20th Amendment, at the peak of the Great Depression, allowed FDR to take over on January 20th rather than March 4th, shortening the transition to 11 weeks. It has stayed like this ever since. Out of the 45 individuals who served as president up to this day, only one, FDR, served 3 terms and a bit in office, having died early in his 4th term shortly before Nazi Germany capitulated. 13 presidents served 2 full terms, 7 1 full term and 1 partial term, usually because they took over a partial term from a deceased predecessor and were then re-elected. 13 presidents served 1 full term. Once Joe Biden completes his term, this will increase to 14, and 10 less than 1 full term. Only one, Grover Cleveland, served 2 terms that were some years apart. Everyone else who served more than 1 term did it on consecutive terms. In January 2025, Donald Trump will become the 2nd president ever with 2 non-consecutive terms. This also explains the weirdness about the way US presidents are labeled, Grover Cleveland being both president number 22 and 24, and Trump being number 45 and 47. By contrast, presidents serving consecutive terms only get 1 number. Obama is number 44, even though he got elected twice just like Trump, but his terms were one after the other. Until 1951, there were no official term limits for a US president, but there was the informal precedent set by George Washington, who refused to go on past 2 terms. Following FDR being elected 4 times, on February 27, 1951, the Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, introducing a 2-term limit, or a maximum of 10 years if the new president assumed the presidency mid-term and served less than 2 years in their predecessor's term. And the last-minute interesting statistic I read in The Economist while editing the video, Donald Trump was the first person to win a major party's nomination 3 times in a row since FDR. So when Washington started as president, there were no political parties, and he was elected unanimously, but during his administration, conflicts between those in favor of a strong federal government and those wanting more power devolved to the states led to the formation of the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, and the Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. After Thomas Jefferson's election to president, the Democratic Republican Party became dominant, but by 1828, factions within it led to a split into the Democratic and National Republican parties. The Whig Party then appeared in the 1830s, supporting the supremacy of Congress over the presidency, economic protectionism, and modernization. In 1854, the Republican Party was founded in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and opposition to the expansion of slavery into new territories, with Abraham Lincoln becoming the first Republican president. Overall, until 2024, the US had 19 Republican presidents, 16 Democrats, 4 Democratic Republicans, 4 Whigs, 1 Federalist, John Adams, and 1 National Unionist, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was originally a Democrat who joined Abraham Lincoln on a National Union ticket, which was a temporary coalition of Republicans and War Democrats created to appeal to pro-Union Democrats during the Civil War. Despite his National Union label, Johnson's policies and principles aligned more closely with those of the Democratic Party, and he returned to the Democrats after leaving office. John Quincy Adams was the first president to be photographed in 1843, albeit this is 14 years after having left the presidency. Calvin Coolidge was the first to do a radio broadcast on December 6, 1923, and Harry Truman the first to start regularly addressing the American people on TV from the White House.
The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
Martin Van Buren was the first president born in the US after the Declaration of Independence, and JFK the first to be born in the 20th century. JFK was also the first Roman Catholic president. Joe Biden was the oldest president on Inauguration Day at 78, Teddy Roosevelt the youngest to assume office at 42, even though he was not elected, but succeeded following William McKinley's assassination, and JFK was the youngest elected president at 43. Teddy Roosevelt was the youngest to leave office at 50, and Joe Biden will be the oldest at 82 when he completes the current term. And with Joe Biden about to depart from the White House, we also come to the end of part 1 of our 2-part video series. Stay tuned for part 2, where we are going to start by looking at the age-old question, does size, or in this case height, matter if you want to be the President of the United States? I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to give me a massive thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing for more content like this on Planetary Matters. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.